Welcome to week number 6. This is on the French clinical tradition and the rise of Freud. In this lecture, we're going to look at how people with mental illness basically in Europe were treated up until the early 20th century. We're going to look at the connection between the discovery of magnetism in the 1700s and Freud's use of hypnotism 150 years later. And we will see how society's use of women led them to be treated differently when it came to mental illness. Since the dawn of humankind, people have made judgments about what is considered normal and abnormal behavior, and various remedies and treatments were given to try to rid people of their abnormal thoughts and behaviors. At times, possession of demons or evil spirits were considered to be the cause, and there's evidence that since prehistoric times, people would perform trephining, which involved cutting a hole in the skull to apparently let the demons or spirits escape. In addition, people who showed abnormal behavior were often given potions or tonics with the aim of making that human host an uncomfortable place for the demon or spirit to remain. Although the Greeks and the Romans developed various humane approaches to such ailments, by the time we get to the Middle Ages, the treatment of mental illness in Europe fell back to the way they had been before the Greeks. Medieval attempts to take care of dysfunctional behaviors were often conducted by members of the clergy, and they would involve prayer and the application of holy water and religious relics. Once again, their goal was to drive away the evil spirit by making the human host's environment unpalatable. In the mid-13th century, some of these practices were adapted such that many mentally ill people were caught up in accusations of witchcraft. By the 15th century, people with mental illness were beginning to be gathered together and put involuntarily into asylums. The function of these asylums wasn't so much to treat the person, but to get them separated from the rest of the population. The conditions in these earliest institutions were filthy, brutal, and degrading. One of the worst of these was St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, which was later shortened to Bethlehem, which then also was called Bedlam, a word that is synonymous today with madness and uproar. The institution itself started in the 1300s and then moved to a different location in the 1600s and was built again in 1791 in St. George's Fields as depicted here. Here's a painting of Bedlam by William Hogarth in which he talks about, tells the story of a rake's progress, and it's basically how a rich man's son, Tom Requell, ends up, because of his immoral living, ends up in Bedlam, and you can see what it kind of looks like there. Now, that's kind of the way things were like for, couple hundred years there in these different asylums, until we get to Philippe Pinel, who lived from 1745 to 1826. Now, Pinel came from a family of physicians, and he received his medical degree in 1773 from the University of Toulouse in France. Upon beginning his practice, he was so upset by the greed and insensitivity of his fellow physicians that he moved to Paris, and there he concentrated on treating the city's poor people. He became interested in mental illness when a close friend became afflicted with a mental disorder, and Pinel couldn't treat him. He read the existing literature on mental illness and consulted with the so-called experts of the time, and found the information on mental illness was essentially worthless except for the work of Joseph Daquin from 1732 to 1815. Daquin believed that mental illness was a natural phenomenon that could be studied and treated by means of the methods of natural science. Pinel and Daquin then dedicated the second edition of his book, Philosophy of Madness. Daquin dedicated the second edition of his book, Philosophy of Madness, in 1793 to Pinel. Pinel began writing influential articles in which he argued for the humane treatment of people with mental disturbances. In 1793, he was appointed the director of the Baquets Asylum, which had been an institution for the insane since 1660. Upon touring this facility, he found that the most inmates were chained and guards patrolled the walls to prevent escape. So he asked for permission to release the prisoners from their chains, and although the authorities thought Pinel himself was insane for having such a wish, they reluctantly gave him permission. And he proceeded cautiously. Starting in 1793, he removed the chains from a small number of inmates and carefully observed their consequences. The first inmate to be unchained was an English soldier who had once crushed a guard's skull with his chains and was considered to be a violent person. Once released from his chains, however, he moved to be nonviolent, and he helped Pinel care for the other inmates. 2 years later, the soldier was released from the Baquets. Pinel gradually removed more inmates from their constraints, improved their rations, stopped bloodletting, and forbade all harsh treatment such as whirling an inmate in his chair. In his book, A Treatise on Insanity, Pinel said of bloodletting, "The blood of maniacs is sometimes so lavishly spilled and with so little discernment as to render it doubtful whether the patient or his physician has the best claim to the appellation madman." In addition to unchaining inmates and terminating bloodletting and harsh treatment, Pinel was responsible for many innovations in the treatment of mental illness. He would segregate different types of patients. He encouraged occupational therapy. He favored bathing and mild enemas as physical treatments. And he argued effectively against the use of any form of punishment or exorcism. In addition, he was the first to maintain precise case histories and statistics on his patients, including a careful record of cure rates. Under Pinel's leadership, the number of inmate deaths decreased greatly, and the number of inmates cured and released increased greatly. His success at the Bicêtre led to his 1795 appointment as director of La Salpetriere, the largest asylum in Europe, which housed 8,000 insane women. Following the same procedures as he did at Bicêtre, Pinel had equally dramatic success. When he died of pneumonia in 1826, he was given a hero's funeral, which was not only attended by the most influential people in Europe, but also by hundreds of ordinary citizens, including many former patients from the Bicêtre and Salpetriere asylums. Partially because of his success, and partly because of the zeitgeist, people throughout Europe and the United States began to argue for the more humane treatment of the mentally disturbed. In Britain, William Tute, who was a Quaker and a prosperous retired tea and coffee merchant with no medical training, visited a lunatic asylum and was horrified by what he saw, and he dedicated the remaining 30 years of his life to improving the plight of those with mental illness. And in 1792, he founded the York Retreat. At the retreat, designed more like a farm than a prison, inmates were given good food, freedom, respect, medical treatment, recreation, and religious instruction, and this became a model for other institutions around the world. A couple other examples of people I have here on this slide would also include Vincenzo Chiarugi in Italy, Benjamin Rush and Dorothea Dix in the United States. And you can hear is a speech from Dorothea Dix. "I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this commonwealth, in cages, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." They all followed these examples of Pinel, freed people from these confines that they had, these chains, and started having more humane treatment and much better responses with these patients. So that gives you a sense of how things finally started to turn after centuries of stigmatization and very terrible treatment given to people who showed abnormal behavior. With that context now, I'm going to jump to a completely sort of different story here about treating mental illness. And in this next part of the lecture, you're going to kind of go through a very interesting story involving this person, Franz Anton Mesmer, who lived from 1734 to 1850. Mesmer is the place where we get that word mesmerism, or that to say that someone's been mesmerized. So it's Mesmer who that word is kind of coined from. So let me tell you a little bit about Mesmer and tell you how he kind of fits in with all of this. Now, little is known of his life up until 1766, when he received a doctorate in medicine from the University of Vienna at the age of 32. So he was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He listed several other degrees after his name on the title page of his thesis, but historians have never found evidence that he actually earned these degrees. The title of his thesis was on the influence of planets, and it was largely plagiarized from an English follower of Isaac Newton, which argued that planetary gravitational influences directly affect biological organisms on Earth. So it was a bit of a crackpot thesis, and it was mostly plagiarized, but at the time, it wasn't detected. So none of these faked credentials and plagiarism affected him in his lifetime because no one knew about him, and thus it didn't hinder his career. After he graduated, he married a very wealthy widow who was 10 years his senior, and he became a social celebrity in Vienna. He'd probably be an influencer in today's language. He was a skilled amateur musician. He befriended several musical celebrities, including Leopold Mozart and his prodigy son, Wolfgang Amadeus. Mesmer commissioned the opera Bastien and Bastien from the 12-year-old Wolfgang and staged its premiere performance in a theater that he had built in his own large and luxurious gardens. When Benjamin Franklin invented the glass harmonica, a musical instrument played by rubbing damp fingers against a rotating glass drum, which gives you the sound of glass being rubbed, Mesmer obtained one of these and became a virtuoso on it. And it looks like Mozart may have even written one of his pieces for the glass harmonica for Mesmer to play. I want to give you a little example of how the glass harmonica sounds with this clip. So now that you have a little bit of idea of the glass harmonica, let's move back to his medical career. Now, Mesmer and a local Jesuit priest named Maximilian Hell became enthusiastic about the subject of magnetism. It seemed to them that it was one of a group of invisible and mysterious fluids with potentially marvelous scientific consequences. Others included the recently discovered electricity, gravitation, and the gases that can make balloons miraculously rise to the sky. So this seemed to be another one of these kinds of important gases or fluids, magnetism. Now, keep in mind that he actually was a physician and he would treat patients occasionally. And he and this priest, as I said, became enthusiastic about the subject of magnetism. And so they started to think about how it might be applied in a medical situation. In 1773, Mesmer was treating Franziska Oosterlin, a young relative of his wife, who suffered from periodic attacks of what Mesmer called hysterical fever. These would include convulsions, spasms of vomiting, inflammation of the intestines, the inability to make water, agonizing toothache and earache, despondency, insane hallucinations, cataleptic trance, fainting, temporary blindness, feelings of suffocation, attacks of paralysis lasting for days, and other terrible symptoms. So it sounds pretty bad. Well, he had her swallow a preparation containing iron, and then he would attach magnets to various parts of her body. So she drinks this kind of fluid that has some iron in it, and then he touches parts of her body with these magnets. And what happened was she would enter a crisis state when he did this that would involve twitching, convulsions, and intense pain in the location of each of her symptoms. He had her come back again and again. He would repeat this treatment each time, and eventually she did get better. In fact, Mozart's father, Leopold, had seen her at her emaciated sickest, and when he encountered her 6 years later, he reported, "On my honor, I hardly recognized her. She's so large and fat. She has married 3 children, 2 girls and a boy." Now, interestingly, Mesmer didn't believe that the magnets had achieved the cure on their own. He felt that he had contributed his own animal magnetism, which had accumulated in his body, to her. So he believed that all people had some sort of natural magnetism inside them, called animal magnetism, and he had a particular large amount of this animal magnetism. So he eventually, over the years, stopped using magnets altogether because he felt that he had enough of this magnetism in his own body. He did, though, start treating other patients with the magnets first, and but the difference was that now that he had already treated Franziska, he could now know what to expect, and so he would directly and indirectly suggest to his new patients that they would fall into a crisis state upon the application of these magnets. And many of the patients reacted just as he expected, and then he treated the treatment without the magnets, just merely passing his hands over his patients' bodies while asserting that they would fall into crisis. In 1775, Mesmer was invited to give his opinion before the Munich Academy of Sciences on the exorcisms that was carried out by Joseph Gassner, a priest and a healer who had grown up in Austria. Mesmer said that while Gassner was sincere in his beliefs, his cures, his exorcism, resulted because the priest possessed a high degree of animal magnetism, which he believed was just as powerful as a real magnet. And so you had this sort of secular idea, this scientific idea of Mesmer's, that really this priest had a lot of magnetism in him already, and the magnetism was what's causing these changes in these people when they did the exorcism, versus the Gassner's religious beliefs that it was actually God moving through him and helping expel the demon that was inside there. So this became sort of a confrontation that eventually ended the career of the priest. The priest sort of lost the day here after the Academy had voted against him that it was really exorcism. Now, while he was still there in Vienna, things were going pretty well for him. He had another patient, and her name was Maria Theresa Paradis. She was a teenaged piano prodigy who had been blind since the age of 3. She started coming to see him to help with her blindness, and Mesmer claimed to have restored her sight with magnetism. So as she got better with his treatment with these magnets, her parents removed her from his care, and she became blind again. Her parents then went to some more conventional physicians in Vienna, and they all together started calling Mesmer a charlatan and charged him with improper conduct. Mesmer's supporters replied that the parents were upset only because her celebrity value had decreased when she gained normal vision. Now, we don't really know what the truth is in this particular case. It is possible that she could have suffered from some sort of psychogenic blindness that Mesmer really did alleviate temporarily through his treatment. But nevertheless, because he now had conventional physicians kind of voting against him, this made him have to leave Vienna in disgrace in 1777. So by February of 78, he had moved to Paris and rented an apartment in a part of a city preferred by the wealthy and the powerful, and he established a medical practice. And there he would actually reunite with Mozart, who often would visit with him. So what's Mesmer going to do now that he's in Paris? Well, Paris itself soon divided into those who thought that he was a charlatan, who had been forced to flee from Vienna, and those who thought he had made a great discovery. So he actually had several fans and people who were like disciples who would go off and teach some of these ideas about magnetism in terms of treatment. You have to keep in mind that this was an unstable period in French life, as the French Revolution was about to happen in the next decade. Parisian society was particularly prone to fads, and animal magnetism, as promoted by Mesmer, was a perfect fad. Even though he spoke a heavily accented French that few fully understood, and he would charge enormous fees that few could afford, He soon attracted more clients than he could handle individually. So he devised his famous Baquet, the French word for tub, as a means of mass producing these magnetic cures. So you could have more than one person at a time get the benefits of magnetism. So you can see there's a real Baquet over there on the left. It's from a museum site. And so people would hold on to those bars that are coming from the top. And then the Baquet would be filled with water, and iron fillings that were magnetized were put into the bottom. On the right, you can see some people in what was called a seance. A seance is just a session where people are holding on to their iron rods. So this tub was supposedly storing this invisible magnetic fluid, which presumably stored an electrical charge. It was kind of an early battery, so it actually probably was sending some sort of current through the person's body. And like I said, this is like a magnetic field, and so if you took the metal handle that was into the Baquet and placed it or touched a different part of your body, it was supposedly bringing the magnetic force to that part of your body. He would often do this in the middle of a dimly lit treatment room, and the patients would enter in groups and they would sit around the Baquet grasping the handles while he would play ethereal music on his glass harmonica to help set the mood. After a suitable state of anticipation had been established in the patients, most of whom already had a good idea of what to expect before they came, Mesmer would emerge, dressed in a flowing, lilac-colored robe, and began pointing his finger or an iron rod at the afflicted parts of the patients' bodies. Usually 1 or 2 patients would pass into a crisis state and served as models for the others. And soon the room was full of convulsing, crisis-ridden patients, and the most violent of these would be carried by Mesmer and his assistants to a clearly marked crisis room for individual attention. Not all the patients experienced a complete crisis, but even some of these partial responders found their symptoms improved after the session was over. Note how important it was that suggestion and social contagion were for this process. That social contagion is basically modeling how one should act, and then it starts to kind of pass around virally where other people start to copy what you're doing. So there's a lot of suggestion and social contagion happening in these kind of cases, in these social situations. This is captured very well in a scene from a movie called Mesmer, a 1994 film that starred Alan Rickman, whom you may remember from the Harry Potter movies. The 2 women that are pictured in this poster are apparently the characters of Maria Therese Paradise and Franziska Osterlein, who are supposedly kind of like his love interests in the movie. The scene I'm going to show you features many of the elements that I was just talking about in one of Mesmer's seances. There's a session here again with a Baquet, and you'll even see that someone's playing the glass harmonica as Mesmer goes around the room, helping his patients tap into the magnetic force, and he uses his own touch, because he's full of animal magnetism, to also help them heal. Just a warning about what you're about to see will become quite intense, and it might be a little scary near the end of the clip.
Mesmer, my back. Can you do anything about my back?
Your back, Duchess.
It hurts, you see. Especially at certain times, don't it?
At night?
Certain nights.
And when you are, not alone in your bed?
Oh, you are the first doctor ever to understand.
Milady, your nerves are out of alignment. Pardon me, if your husband could just...
I was not talking about my husband, sir.
Whomsoever. The diagnosis remains the same, whatever the shape or size of the member. You see before you the conductors of my power. Don't be frightened if you swoon away. Don't resist. Let it caress you, whisper to you, murmur to you as the force in me comes flowing into your flesh, your nerves, your bones. Take hold. Hold the rope. senses. Don't be alarmed. Safe in my hands. Put the rugs on whatever part of your body ails you. Now. Now. Vessel fluid is flowing. It's gathering strength. Feel it. Sense it. It surges. It meets the obstacle. Let it fight the pain. Your body is now a battlefield. Can the light win? Will it? Will it? Will it? The struggle, the fight, from my hands to you, as it contends with your ailments, untangles your nerves, stifles the obstacles. Release yourself. Release. It surges stronger. Release yourself.
Now, Mesmer desperately tried to get official and scientific recognition for his treatments, but he never did. He ran into two big problems in 1784. First, he joined the royal court and attended a gala concert by a celebrated blind musician from Vienna. That is, none other than Maria Theresa Paradise. He suffered one of the worst humiliations of his life when they ran into each other. There was lots of gossip about this and about his early experiences with the girl, and his obvious failure to cure her permanently, and all of this gossip immediately began to circulate through Parisian society. And the second blow came when the king ordered a blue ribbon commission to investigate Mesmer's claims. It happened to be chaired by the American ambassador to France at the time, Benjamin Franklin, the noted scientist, and included also the great chemist Lavoisier and the physician Guillotine, who would soon have developed a more humane way of executing people just in time for the French Revolution. Now, the commission's charge was to actually look at not so much whether his treatment's working, but whether or not he had actually discovered a new physical fluid. So they ran several experiments on this fluid that was in these Baquets. And they ended up concluding that there was no evidence for such a fluid. They found, for instance, that when they submitted themselves to the magnetic induction, they proved insusceptible, and there was nothing that affected them. But they soon discovered that good subjects who would be attached to these Baquets would fall into crisis when presented with something that they believed was magnetized, but it wasn't. So you see, they kind of did a controlled experiment there where these guys are the good subjects are holding on to their bars of the Baquet, but there's really nothing in the Baquet that's magnetic, and they still go through all of this. They unanimously concluded on the question of the existence and the utility of animal magnetism that there was no proof of its existence, that this fluid without its existence is consequently without utility. Note that they didn't actually deny that patients were sometimes affected, but they attributed this just to the influence of suggestion or imagination rather than a physical force. That might be psychologically interesting to us today, but back then it was viewed as evidence of a sham. So therefore, mesmerism was branded a bogus science, and the commission discouraged legitimate scientists and doctors from taking mesmerism seriously. So for many years, the serious study of what we can call now hypnotic phenomena became relegated to scientific amateurs. Mesmer himself disappeared into relative obscurity after that, but he still had followers who kept the practice of magnetism alive. Mark. One of these followers was Amand Marie Jacques de Chastenet, the Marquis de Puysegur. I apologize for my poor French pronunciation, who lived from 1751 to 1825. Now, he was a follower of Mesmer, but he didn't like this convulsive and violent nature of these mesmeric crisis stages that you saw in the film clip. One day, he must have been thinking about this because he implicitly seemed to have conveyed it to one of his male servants who he was magnetizing. And because of this, instead of becoming crisis-ridden, the young man entered a peaceful, sleep-like trance instead. In this trance, he continued to respond to Puysegur's voice, answering his questions and even performing complicated activities. Upon command, he talked about his work, he pretended to shoot for a prize, and he danced happily to imagined music. And then he awoke with no recollection of these events, although upon being remagnetized and resuming the trance, he would remember them. Puysegur soon found that he could reproduce this in other patients and bypass the crisis period altogether, simply by using it and suggesting it clearly with words. He referred to this new state as the perfect crisis, and later called it artificial somnambulism because it now seemed similar to sleepwalking. And he and his colleagues began using this technique, and they developed some other observations when treating their patients. So for instance, they discovered that the magnetist had to listen to the person seeking relief, and often the client had to re-experience painful feelings while they were having this discussion while the person was being magnetized. The sessions had to be of regular frequency and duration, so you would come back for multiple treatments. The magnetist had to be neutral and patient, and the symptoms might return temporarily in between sessions, but if you stuck with it, you could possibly relieve these symptoms in the patient. So you can see a lot of this is like breaking new ground with mesmerism, and it's still not catching on with the main medical community because by this point it's considered just a faddish sham sort of treatment, but people like this were able to kind of continue to work on it in the sidelines. Now, here's some further developments that happened with this. First of all, I have here Faria, who was a Portuguese priest who had lived in India before he settled in Paris. He was interested in why not all people responded equally well to the magnetist's induction procedure. And he discovered that anyone who was appropriately predisposed to the induction could be put into one of these trances, but people differed in how susceptible they were to this. He argued that it had to do with the thinness of the blood. So people who had more thin blood were less able to be, were less susceptible to this. But even though this theory was wrong, he did help change the emphasis from it being that it was the ability of the person doing the mesmerism to the characteristics of the person who actually was being mesmerized. John Elliotson was a physician in London's University College Hospital. In 1837, he had seen a stage mesmerist and was intrigued by what he saw, and he planned to investigate its properties as an anesthesia for surgery. But when they heard these plans, the University Council passed a resolution instructing the hospital board to ban the practice of mesmerism or animal magnetism in the hospital. So Elliotson ended up resigning his position in protest. He continued practicing medicine privately and used mesmerism as a technique, and found it so fruitful that he even started a new journal called Zoist in 1843 that was an outlet to publish research on mesmerism. It only lasted until 1856, and Elliotson himself was never really able to make much of an impact on the medical community because he was now on the fringes of it rather than being part of one of the major university hospitals. Then we have James Esdale, who was a Scottish physician who was practicing in India. And there in India, he trained his assistants to magnetize patients before their operations. And thus, he became the first person to employ mesmeric anesthesia on a large scale and tabulate his results. He performed more than 300 operations involving mesmerism in the late 1840s, many of them for the removal of scrotal tumors. Now, among his mesmerized patients, the mortality rate went from around 50%, which was sort of normal, so about 50% of people would die in surgery without anesthesia, and he brought this down to 5% using mesmerism. Unfortunately, when he tried to publish these results and present it to the British Medical Association, they kind of had a racist response to it because both the assistants and the patients were Indians, and they believed that these Indians were not good participants to have for this research because the racist belief was that Indian patients liked to be operated on and that they were merely acting to help Esdale with his research. So no one really took these findings very seriously. Now, mesmerism as an anesthesia technique may have continued to be developed at this point, and maybe would have actually had more of an impact in the mid-19th century. But then around that time, some important chemical anesthesia techniques were developed. So you have, for instance, Horace Wells in 1844, who develops a local anesthesia, a chemical one that can be given when you're having your teeth extracted. And then William Morton in 1846 develops a general anesthesia where you can basically put the person out completely while the operation is being performed. And it was because of the success of those kinds of chemical anesthesias that you really didn't have as much interest anymore then in using possibly mesmerism for it. But I'll mention one more person here, and that's James Braid. He was a Scottish physician who gave mesmerism a more scientific approach. He had seen a stage mesmerist perform, and he was able to later work with that mesmerist and one of his own patients to show that when they were mesmerized, the patient had less sensitivity to pain. And he really believed this was a real thing. So Braid continued a series of controlled experiments and demonstrated basically the full range of mesmeric effects that others had already documented in the previous decades. He thought that this trance that happened when you mesmerize something was akin to sleep, and so in 1843, he coined a new term, calling it neuropenology, from the Greek roots of neuro for the nervous system, and hypnos for sleep. And he used this neuropenology to basically cover the range of mesmeric phenomena that they already knew about. He later changed this simply to hypnotism, which gave then mesmerism a new and more respectable sounding name, and that became the term that everybody used from that point on. In fact, what we use still today, the term hypnotism. Now with a more respectable name, more people were taking hypnotism seriously as a medical treatment. Back in France, a modest country doctor called Auguste Libault decided to begin experimenting with hypnotic therapies, and he offered his patients an unusual bargain. He said, you could be treated hypnotically for free, or if you prefer the standard methods, you can pay the standard fees. So what he would do is he would use this fairly simple, straightforward method. He would tell each patient to stare deeply into his eyes while he repeatedly gave instructions to sleep. And as soon as the patient fell into this light sleep-like state, Libault noticed that the symptoms that they had complained about before were gone. They had disappeared. By the mid-1860s, he had so many patients that liked this treatment that he had to ask them to start paying, and he even temporarily retired for a moment to write a book about his treatment. In this book, he argued that the hypnotic state resembles normal sleep, except that the subject remains in a constant conscious rapport with the hypnotist throughout. Now, not many people bought this book, and in fact, the book was a huge failure. I think it only just sold a handful of copies. But a young doctor from the city of Nancy in France, Hippolyte Bernheim, came across this book and visited Libault in 1882. He soon abandoned his traditional ways of treating patients and became a full-time hypnotherapist, treating hundreds of different patients and carefully analyzing their various responses to hypnosis. Like Faria and Braid, who believed that the characteristics of the subject mattered more about whether or not the hypnosis would work, Bernheim compared the characteristics of people who were able to fall to the hypnotic induction well compared to people who were non-responders. And he concluded that his more successful cases were people who came from the lower as opposed to the upper social classes. He speculated that lower class patients may have been more conditioned towards strict obedience than their wealthier counterparts. He argued, overall, that human beings varied on a general trait of suggestibility, defined as the aptitude to transform an idea into an act. He continued to write about this in medical journals, and the whole approach of his and Liebold's approach to hypnotherapy became known as the Nancy School. That leads us to our next character in this mesmerism hypnotism storyline, and that's Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot was the son of a carriage builder, and he chose medicine over art as a career. As a relatively impoverished medical student, he had been required to work in Paris's vast Salpetriere hospital, which we talked about before when I was talking about Pinel's freeing of the inmates there. This enormous women's hospital housed several thousand indigent and ill women in more than 40 buildings. This wasn't considered a desirable location for a doctor to work, but Charcot thought that the Salpetriere would be a potential treasure trove of neurological cases, so he resolved that he would come back to it once he was an established senior physician. He finished medical school and he became a private physician and a traveling companion to a wealthy banker. And then he used his contacts with the wealthy banker to establish a flourishing private practice. Interestingly, like Mesmer, he married a wealthy widow, and this helped him enter into the higher stratosphere of Parisian society. When he was finally financially secure, he returned to the La Salpetriere and as the senior physician in 1862. Now, the hospital there still exists, and it's still quite a fantastic place. In 2014, I visited La Salpetriere Hospital. I just walked into the grounds one early morning, and you can see sort of how nice the architecture is there. It's interesting, this hospital was also the hospital where they took Princess Diana when she was dying from that car accident back in, what was that now, 1997. This is where she actually passed away, but this is the hospital that they took her to. So the hospital is still a functioning hospital and has lots of different buildings, and you can see again, sort of an idea of the architecture. And I said it's a vast campus with lots and lots of buildings. And you notice that I can see on this map that some of the buildings are actually named after Pinel. But this has been originally set up as an insane asylum and now has been converted to one of the major hospitals for Paris. Well, anyway, back to Charcot. When he now took over at the Salpetriere in 1862, he quickly expanded the research and teaching facilities of the hospital. And he conducted or directed much important research there on epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and other neurological diseases. He was known for giving brilliant lectures in which he would imitate the symptoms of various neurological diseases, and he would engage with the patients in dramatic dialogue, and even have them wear hats with long feathers, whose different vibrations would illustrate different kinds of tremors. By the 1880s, his lectures had become popular major cultural events, attracting audiences of writers, philosophers, even famous actresses, as well as doctors. The French government officially recognized Charcot's achievements in 1882 by creating a new post especially for him as professor of neuropathology. Now, Charcot believed that many neurological diseases occurred either in a pure and complete form, which he referred to as the type for each illness, or more commonly, a partial or incomplete form of the illness. And the way he would do this is he would observe a large number of patients, because he had so many patients there at this hospital, but he would round up pretty much all the patients that had a particular disease and then make observations of them to figure out what were the small number of characteristics that were kind of common across them, and then he would use that to determine the type. He even started to use the words grand and mal to talk about whether or not someone had all the characteristics of the disease. So if you had the grand version, that meant you had the type, whereas the petite version was that you had some of the characteristics, but not all of them. And this is where, for instance, that we still have today, we talk about grand mal seizures versus a petit mal seizure. It has to do with whether or not you have all of the characteristics of a seizure when you're talking about a grand mal seizure. So we can now take this more to psychiatry and to hysteria, because beginning in the 1870s, Charcot began to study a group of patients who suffered from what was labeled hysteria at the hospital. These people, these women, their symptoms included fits of violent emotion, paralysis, anesthesia, convulsion, and memory loss that seemed to partially mimic epileptic seizures and other neurological symptoms. These patients showed no obvious organic lesions, however, so it didn't seem to have anything physical that you could point to. And their symptoms had several other features uncharacteristic of ordinary neurological disease. For example, some hysteric paralyses and anesthesias occurred only in sharply delineated body parts, such as a part of the hand or just the wrist that was normally covered by a glove. Anatomically, this made no sense because the nerves of the hand and the arm fall in no such pattern. So these afflictions if it was an affliction from ordinary nerve damage, you wouldn't see such sharp boundaries. In general, the hysteric patients, their symptoms resembled ordinary neuropathology, but didn't seem to follow any accepted or understood rules of neurology. Now, the word hysteria and this concept of hysteria actually dates back to the ancient Greeks. Hippocrates and others believed that hysteria was an exclusively feminine disease, and it was caused by the physical wandering of the uterus. So in fact, that's what the Greek word hysteria means, the wandering. And it formed in the abdomen and would kind of move around in the abdomen to other parts of the body and cause symptoms to occur. So as therapy, the Greeks would often prescribe a foul-smelling substance to be rubbed on the afflicted areas and a sweet-smelling one on some other part of the abdomen to entice the uterus to go back to its proper place. And sometimes this seemed to help. Later, the great physician Galen recognized that the uterus itself couldn't really wander, it's fixed there, and he refined the theory by suggesting that the organ instead gave off some sort of pathogenic fluid or vapor that collected in different symptom sites. He prescribed using smelling salts to disperse and dilute these vapors, and sometimes this treatment was followed by improvement. Now, when Charcot began to study hysteria 17 centuries later, most medical thinking about hysteria had not really improved much. The prevailing medical opinion dismissed hysteria as just simple malingering, that the symptoms violated the accepted rules of neuroanatomy and basically strained the credulity of many mechanistically oriented doctors. And there was also still this overwhelming belief that this was a feminine disease related to an abnormal reproductive system. Charcot challenged both these views by first of all stating that hysterical symptoms were too distressing to be faked. And secondly, he had observed several men outside the hospital who showed identical symptoms. And because of the latter, that meant to Charcot that it had nothing actually to do with the female reproductive system. He used his general techniques to study hysteria, first by observing a large number of patients, and then identified just a few as representing the pure type for the condition. These patients suffered from the grand version or major hysteria. An examination of these patients convinced Charcot that their symptoms could be produced or alleviated by pressing on particular body locations or hysterogenic zones. So when a major hysterical attack occurred, they would tend to come in a regular 4-stage progression. There would be this epileptoid stage where the symptoms seemed to be similar to the onset of a grand mal epileptic seizure. There was a large movement stage where the patients performed seemingly automatic and sometimes violent acts. There was an hallucinatory stage where you would have imaginary sensations and feelings becoming subjectively real to the patient. And finally, there was a delirious stage. Now, the majority of patients who failed to show this perfectly regular sequence of symptoms were said to have had petite hysteria or minor hysteria. Patients, though, with grand hysteria were regularly featured at Charcot's public lectures, and they became genuine celebrities at the hospital. They appeared to revel in their role, and they would compete with each other for attention. Sometimes it was reported that one might even mischievously sabotage a rival's demonstration by pushing her hysterogenic zone to turn her symptoms off just before the public demonstration. Charcot speculated that the root cause of hysteria lay in a hereditary, progressive, and generalized degeneracy of the nervous system, which interferes with the ability to integrate and interconnect memories and ideas in a normal way. Thus, individual memories and emotional reactions that normally would cluster together become dissociated and are experienced by hysterics in isolation from one another. He was also struck by the fact that hypnotized subjects seem to have a lot in common with hysterical patients. Highly responsive hypnotic subjects would experience paralysis, anesthesias, and amnesias, and they often performed consciously inexplicable acts, like that might be some sort of post-hypnotic suggestion, just as hysterical patients did. Hypnosis and hysteria both produced physical and mental anomalies that made little sense anatomically, and that seemed beyond the conscious control of the subject or the patient. And some of Charcot's prize patients with major hysteria turned out to be highly hypnotizable, and in fact demonstrated their cycles of symptoms even more perfectly when they were hypnotized. From this coincidence, Charcot concluded that hypnotic susceptibility was in fact a symptom of hysteria. Only people with pathological nervous systems should experience such dissociable effects. Deciding that hypnosis deserved further study as an aspect of hysteria, Charcot reasoned that the best cases to examine closely would be the best cases of hysteria. Thus, his major hysterics started doing double duty, serving as prime exemplars of hypnotic susceptibility in the Salpetriere research. Now, Charcot's assistants would do most of the actual hypnotizing in this research, and one of the most important subjects was this woman named Blanche Whitman, or Wit, because of her particular performance on the stage and her sort of haughty attitude that she would have towards the other patients. She actually even had the nickname Queen of the Hysterics. And you can see she's depicted in this famous painting of Charcot is standing there in front of one of his public lectures, and he has Wit sort of passed out in his arm. When hypnotized, Wit and these other major hysterical patients would pass through 3 stages. Catalepsy, where they would become muscularly relaxed, motionless, and generally insensitive to external stimulation. Lethargy, where the body muscles were flaccid but sporadically activated into strong contractions and movements. And somnambulism. These were complex automatic movements and actions that would occur upon suggestion. This resembled the deep trances of the early magnetic and hypnotic subjects. Again, Charcot noted that some of these hypnotic subjects were more likely to follow all 3 stages in order, and they were labeled as having the grand version of hypnosis, whereas others just had 1 to 2 of these stages and therefore had the petite version. So I guess in this painting, we can see that Wit is either in the catalepsy stage or the lethargy stage, because it looks like she just sort of lost control of her muscles. Charcot and his assistants did do some serious research on this, and they even published some images of some of these hysterics going through hypnosis, and you can see these are examples that appear in the book about this with some photographic plates of the hysterical patient. In 1882, he presented this theory to the French Academy of Sciences, and the subject of hypnotism had been in an official disgrace in France ever since the Franklin Commission with Mesmer. And the Academy had twice since rejected reports on it. But Charcot had immense prestige at this point, and that basically ensured that he would be carefully heard. And in fact, his neurologically oriented theory appealed to the mechanistic basis of the scientific establishment, and thus his presentation was met with enthusiastic approval. Charcot was able to legitimize hypnotism as a subject of study by an official French scientific organization. Now, just as hypnotism was getting its scientific respect, though, controversies about it broke out. Remember that Bernheim of the Nancy School was hypnotizing hundreds of subjects himself, as opposed to just a select handful at the Salpetriere. And Bernheim had concluded that hypnotic susceptibility was a variable but normal characteristic present in many people who were not suffering from major hysteria. In his patients, states of catalepsy and lethargy had not inevitably been preceded by somnambulism. Thus, he attacked Charcot's theory and charged that major hypnotism was in fact an artifact of this peculiar setting they had at this hospital. Charcot and his disciples reacted angrily, and this dispute started to fill the French scientific literature throughout the 1880s. Serious questioning of his theory also began in the mid-1880s when Charcot's young assistants, Alfred Binet, and you remember Binet was the guy who did the work on mental testing in the last lecture, Alfred Binet and Charles Fier reported some surprising experiments with Blanche Whitman. They had reintroduced the use of magnets in their hypnotic sessions. With Whit in her somnambulistic stage, they induced paralysis or other effects on one side of her body, and then reversed the polarity of a large magnet that they held in front of her, and her effects would immediately transfer to the other side. And they could do this for her emotional states as well. After telling the hypnotized Whit that she felt very sad, for example, they would transform her piteous sobs into happy laughter with a simple flick of their magnet. In all seriousness, they suggested that here was an experimental technique for discovering pairs of complementary emotions that were kind of analogous to complementary colors that had already been discovered by researchers in vision. Although they admitted some of these results seemed kind of implausible, they assured their readers that the effect had been entirely unexpected and had issued from nature herself, showing an inexplicable logic. But the logic of these experiments seemed suspicious to one Joseph Delboeuf, who was a respected Belgian physiologist who 5 years earlier had publicly rebuked the young Binet for rushing into print with an ill-researched article on psychophysics. So he had sort of like a beef with Binet, and he had this side interest in hypnosis and was paying attention to what was going on with the Nancy school versus Charcot's theory. So when he saw this impetuous name of Binet on the latest study, he began to doubt. And so one fine morning, he said, "I could not contain myself any longer," and he went to Paris to observe the scene himself. So I'm reading here from Raymond Fancher's book, Pioneers of Psychology. He says, when he got to Paris, he says, "I will never forget those delicious hours. Ferrer and Binet are both young, both tall. Ferrer is more reflective, it seems to me, and more accessible to objections raised. Binet, more adventurous and more affirmative, the former with serious physiognomy, and a clear and profound gaze, the latter with fine features and a mischievous expression. And between them sat the placid and appetizing Whit, not only wearing a complacent look, but finding visible pleasure in getting ready to do anything that should be asked of her. Then myself, the old scholar, head full of reflections and questions, but never having it at hand, this kind of experimental offering, a veritable human guinea pig." And so then the young hypnotists would begin their demonstrations for Delboeuf, and he observed that Whit was extraordinarily responsive to the slightest hints. It was almost as if they were playing her like a piano. A light touch on any muscle or even pointing to it without touching made Whit contract any muscle, even in her ear. And the celebrated magnet was large and wielded openly before Whit. Binet and Ferrer would also speak openly about her expected responses as if she wasn't there. When Delboeuf asked why they did not use an electromagnet whose polarity could be reversed surreptitiously and take other measures to disguise their expectations from Whit, he was told that such was unnecessary because Whit was oblivious to such cues while she was in this somnambulistic stage. Well, he suspected otherwise, and he returned to Belgium to try to replicate the Salpetriere experiments on his own, only with adequate precautions against transmitting prior expectations to his subjects. And he concluded that not only magnetic effects, but also the entire enactments of grand hypnosis were artifacts, the results of patients with great investment in their roles as prize subjects responding to implicit or explicit suggestions from their examiners. And so he became a strong and influential supporter of the Nancy School, and the tide began to turn in their direction. So back in the Salpetriere, these guys started to realize that perhaps they were wrong. They started to realize that Whit maybe was too suggesting and too trying to please them. And so Binet ended up leaving the hospital and then moving on to become the proficient experimental psychologist that he was, in being involved in testing and so on. Charcot also admitted perhaps he had been wrong about hypnotism, and he privately predicted that his theories of hysteria would not long survive after him. It turned out that after he passed away, that that a lot of these theories that he had about hypnosis after 1899 were pretty much gone. Yet for all of his mistakes, he was really a person who made a lot of positive contributions, because quite apart from his earlier neurological achievements in orthodox neurology, he was among the first to explore these interactions between emotional and physical factors. And he also kind of raised hypnosis out of obscurity and made it something that was important that people like Sigmund Freud and Alfred Binet would later use in their own research. So it does lead us to Sigmund Freud. So you might be wondering all along here, why did I even go through all that? It's because it turns out that Freud gets a lot of his important ideas from his time that he spends with Charcot. Now, Freud was born in 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia, which was then part of the Austrian Empire and which is now in the Czech Republic. His father was a merchant, and his mother was 20 years younger than her husband and his third wife. Freud's family moved to Vienna when he was 4. Being Jewish, they were optimistic about a new era in Austria then, in which special taxes and restrictions on Jews had only recently been removed. In 1873, when he was 17, he entered the University of Vienna, where he planned to study law. Instead, he went into medicine, not because he wanted to be a conventional physician, but because philosophy and science fascinated him. He was a brilliant student and researcher, and he ended up working with several famous professors in psychology at the University of Vienna, including Brentano, Brucker, and Mesmer. He didn't receive his degree until 1881. In 1882, he's now has a medical degree. He fell in love, though, with Martha Bernays, and he became secretly engaged to her because he was too poor to establish the kind of respectable bourgeois home that he and his fiancée thought was essential. It was not until 1886, some 5 months after he had opened his practice in Vienna, with the aid of wedding gifts and loans from affluent friends, that they were allowed to finally marry. And within 9 years, they had 6 children, the last of whom, Anna, grew up to be her father's confidant, her secretary, his nurse, and an eminent psychoanalyst in her own right. This picture you see here actually is, I think, shortly after they got married in 1886. Now, just before this marriage, Freud went to Paris to study with Charcot. A number of Freud's patients had complained about hysteria, so one of the things that he wanted to learn about from Charcot was how he dealt with hysteria. And he was particularly impressed with Charcot's use of hypnosis in the treatment of patients with hysteria. So this is like well before all the controversies that arose. Charcot was equally impressed with Freud and gave him permission to translate his writings into German. After attending these lectures by Charcot, Freud then returned to Vienna, eager to apply all the new techniques. And he began collaborating with Joseph Breuer, who attended the university with Freud. So Freud and Breuer worked together at first, introducing the bare outlines of psychoanalytic theory in a series of papers in 1895. Now, before we go into the specifics of Freud's work, I wanted to talk a little bit about the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time in which Freud and Breuer were working. This period of time is kind of like a golden age for Vienna. And the whole overall area has been called the Fin de siècle Vienna, which means basically end of the century Vienna. And from this time near the end of the 19th century, right up to the decades of when World War I started, Vienna just had this flowering of culture and art that hadn't really happened before. And that largely had to do with a lot of economic and political changes that had happened in the empire there, where Vienna was located, in the end of the 19th century. This is actually a map of what it was like there for the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was established by what was known as the Austro-Hungarian Compromise in 1867, in the aftermath of the Austro-Prussian War. It consisted of 2 monarchies, the 2 big ones there on the left. You have Austria in red and Hungary in green, and they had one autonomous region, the Kingdom of Croatia-Slavonia, under the Hungarian crown, which negotiated what was called the Croatian-Hungarian settlement in 1868. The whole overall empire, though, was ruled by the House of Habsburg and constituted the last phase in the constitutional evolution of the Habsburg monarchy. And of course, the capital of all this was Vienna, and that's where the main palaces were for the Habsburgs. Following the 1867 reforms, the Austrian and Hungarian states were co-equal in power. Foreign and military affairs came under joint oversight, but all the government faculties were divided between respective states. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire was a multinational state. So you can actually see it's made up of what we now can recognize as a lot of separate European peoples, like the Germans, Hungarians, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Poles. Very different languages, different cultural backgrounds. It was geographically the second largest country in Europe after the Russian Empire, and it was the 3rd most populous after Russia and the German Empire. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire built up the 4th largest machine building industry of the world after the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Austria-Hungary also became the world's third largest manufacturer and exporter of electrical home appliances and electrical industrial appliances and power generation apparatuses for power plants after the United States and the German Empire. So there's technology, there was a lot of industry going on, the economy was taking off. It was just and then there was like also these changes that had allowed certain reforms and letting more freedoms to, for instance, the Jewish people in these areas. So you had all this change that happened pretty quickly. You can see, by the way, again, where Vienna is here. It's sorry, if you look there in the middle of the map, I think you can see Vienna. And just above that, you'll see Bohemia and Moravia, where Freud was actually born. So his family didn't travel that far to get to Vienna. All right. So anyway, this is, like I said, a very exciting time for Vienna. And in 1979, a book came out called Fin de siècle Vienna, Politics and Culture by Karl Schorsky. It's a really fantastic book. It's still in print. It has lots of neat photographs and lots of interesting highlights about this particular time period. So if you ever do get interested in this period of time, I'd recommend it. But anyway, in Schorsky's book, he kind of highlighted all of these big changes that happened in the arts and in politics. And I just wanted to give you a couple quick little tastes of what it was like. So, for example, one of these tastes that happened was a new kind of music was invented. So there was this composer, Arnold Schoenberg, who developed a kind of music called atonal. I think I'm going to try to play it here, so let's see what happens. And then you have the painter Gustav Klimt. Many of you probably recognize this painting. It's known as The Kiss. It's one of his most famous paintings. It was a very new kind of painting, a very different kind of style. And Klimt and the other painters of that time that kind of had this new sort of style, they became known as the Secessionists. And Klimt is probably the most famous of these Secessionists, and his paintings are worth a lot of money. This is, for instance, one of the murals that he did at the University of Vienna. Unfortunately, some of these murals were destroyed during World War II, but they have stood, many places in Vienna still have a lot of these paintings. The Secessionists really broke off from traditional art in the 19th century. They wanted to have a completely different way of thinking about art. And so they got together and they formed their own gallery so they could go ahead and show their art there. And this is called the Sacrum, which you can see here. It's still there. It's actually a museum that actually houses a lot of the Secessionist art, so you can actually see that if you do go to Vienna. Here's another famous painting by Klimt, and it was featured in the 2015 film A Woman in Gold. And the reason why that's important is because it ended up being sold for $135 million in 2006. It's one of the highest prices ever paid for a painting. Another one of these Secessionist painters was Egon Schiele, and you can see his art style is quite different. Another place that you see things change is in terms of architecture. We have Otto Wagner here, who had a very different architectural style, and this is an example of one of his buildings that he had designed during this time period. It was very different from the rest of Vienna, and I'll show you in a little bit some of the older buildings in Vienna and what they look like, and you can just see that it's a very different kind of style. And again, at that time, this was almost considered revolutionary in terms of how much it changed. In fact, a lot of this was built around what's called the Ringstrasse, and you can kind of see it if you follow where the words are here. There's a whole bunch of important cultural landmarks along the Ringstrasse, and some of these were built during this particular time of Fin de siècle Vienna. There's one of the famous places, the Staatsoper, which was actually an older building. That's where the opera house is, but you can see these other places around Vienna there. I just thought I'd show you some more photos of Vienna just to get a sense of what it was like for Freud. If you do go to Vienna, I went there in 2014. Vienna, very much along this Ringstrasse, still looks probably pretty much the way it would have done during Freud's time. This is the opera house. And then as you walk around, you start to see some of the other buildings and gardens, and you can see a lot of the stuff goes back from the Habsburg Empire and the wealth that the empire actually had. That building up on the upper right there is their city hall, and this is the Schönbrunn Palace that the Habsburgs had that's on the outside, the outskirts of Vienna. This is a photo from the University of Vienna, and you can see their billboards advertising that they've been there since 1365. So this is the university that Freud went to. And I happened to go there on a day when not many students were around. And you can see here that they had a book fair going on. And they have a whole bunch of busts of different famous professors who were once part of the faculty there. One of those was Brentano. Remember that Brentano was one of the teachers of Freud, so they had his statue up. Not far from the University of Vienna, kind of maybe 4 or 5 blocks, there's a park, and here's my wife and son posed in front of what's called the Sigmund Freud Park, and it was a park that was designated in remembrance of Freud. It's not far from his home, and so I think the idea was that Freud probably would have walked through these gardens that are right around here through this park. Or then if you walk a little bit further, you come to the home where Freud lived with his wife and his kids. And it's now a museum. And you can see it's called the Sigmund Freud Museum. And when you go inside there, they still have a lot of the things, like they still have the little sign on the outside of his door when you were to come into his office. It says Professor Dr. Freud. This is a view out the back of their apartment, what their back looked like. It was actually other apartments connected to theirs, but you can see there's the garages of the different apartments out the back. This is one of the waiting rooms where if you were to be a patient, you would have waited out here before you were taken into the main room. This is a funny thing that you would understand now because you've heard me talk about Titchener and some other people, and G. Stanley Hall, that you remember when Freud went over to the United States on a trip with Carl Jung to meet the psychologist there. He was apparently given this honorary award from Clark University, and they had that on a frame there in this museum. Now, here's a photo in here of what it looked like during the occupation of the Nazis, when the Nazis came into Austria, and his house was marked there, you can see, with a swastika. And this became a dangerous time for Freud and his family, so they ended up having to leave in the late 1930s, and they ended up escaping Austria and getting to London while Freud was actually quite ill. And so in the end, Freud and all of his possessions ended up in London. And so in a minute, I'll show you that there's another museum in London that also has Freud's contents in it. Final thing, though, I'll show you just a couple of little things left that were there on the walls in the Vienna Museum. So again, you'll recognize here's a picture of Charcot with Witt giving him the lecture. That's that same photo, that same painting I showed you before. So Freud actually had a copy of this in his office. He was a fan of Charcot. This was actually where his desk was and where he would have seen his patients, and they now have it as just an exhibit room. And you can walk around and listen with a little headpiece there. They give you give you commentary in English or whatever languages you're using. And this has been the doorway that the patients would have come into. And then there's a picture here where his desk, how it would have sat next to the window. And you can see there's a little mirror there in the window, and that mirror is still there. There's Freud sitting at his desk there in Vienna. And there's the mirror, and that's me taking a picture of the mirror while I'm listening to the commentary. So the mirror that he had there to look at himself next to his desk, I guess, to check his hair or whatever was still there. You can actually see a lot of his correspondence in another room that they have with the exhibit, so it's nice that they have all of his letters and journals and so on. This is actually a traveling journal in which he's talking about some of his observations while he was on travel. And there's a little gift shop, and it has books about Freud and all sorts of little fun trinkets about Freud there. So if you ever do get to Vienna, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful city and lots of stuff that have to do with Freud. Now, in 2019, while I was on sabbatical in the UK, I went to London, to Hampstead, which is kind of like a northern suburb of London, where he ended up in the final years of his life. And so they now have another museum there called the Freud Museum of London. And that's the house that his family moved into. And it has a lot of the trinkets, again, that were brought from the leaving of Vienna and moving to London. And so you can see here a lot of his books, his artifacts that he collected as he would travel. Down there in the lower right is actually a prescription from his pharmacist, or he was getting from his doctor to give to his pharmacist for some of the medications that he would have to take when he got older. You can see here that he was a great collector of ancient relics, and so these are all genuine artifacts that he would have collected as he traveled the world, probably worth a lot of money, and he kept them in cases all around him. And when you were one of his patients, you would have come in and seen all of these trinkets everywhere. There's his famous couch, the one that would have been where Dora and all the other patients that he saw would have laid down on when they were seeing Freud. And again, above that of this couch, you can see that they have that painting of Charcot framed just above the couch. So a lot of interesting aspects of Freud. I spent a couple hours in there. Again, they had a really great gift shop. So if you go to London, I highly recommend that you go and visit the museum up in Hampstead. So there's a lot of research done on Freud and his life. And he's a very interesting person. We could really probably go on for a few hours here just talking about his life and all the things that he ended up writing about and so on. I want to go ahead and just highlight maybe some major influences on Freud's thinking, four major influences to kind of think about as you read Dora and as we keep talking about Freud in this lecture and in the next lecture. First of all, remember that he was trained as a medical researcher, which meant that he was more inclined towards careful observation and analysis rather than his experimentation as a method of investigation. So a lot of the other psychology people that we've talked about in this course actually were trained by Wundt or James, and they would have been focused on experimentation or at least introspection or some other method that would be a normal scientific method for investigation. Freud was much more of the kind of person who's going to do case observations and analyses, and that reflects his medical training. Secondly, evolutionary theory, which most of the leading biologists at this point had adopted as fact, had already been around for 20 years when Freud received his medical degree. And he himself was very much taken with Darwin's work and often referred to evolutionary theory. So that does permeate through his thinking as well. The third thing to keep in mind is that consciousness was really the big ticket item there in psychology at that time in the late 1800s. We kind of pointed this out with introspection, for instance, that Titchener and even Wundt really didn't think it was possible that they were even interested in things like the unconscious or things that you couldn't have access to. So they weren't even interested in the operations of your brain that you couldn't reflect on. Well, Freud, of course, thought it was very interesting to pay attention to consciousness, but he was also interested in all that other stuff. And he considered the mind evolved from these more primitive, non-reflective, irrational substrates. So if you believe in evolution, he's thinking consciousness probably evolved quite late. And that would mean that our brains still had lots of other sort of primitive substrates that could be maybe tapped into with his techniques. And finally, the fourth big influence is that he was surrounded by the achievements of the natural sciences. So for instance, Helmholtz had proposed that energy was never lost, it was only conserved. And Freud knew about Helmholtz and what was going on in physics. And so therefore, he had a very positivistic, deterministic, physicalistic approach to understanding these processes. So that is, he strongly believed what he was doing was part of natural science. And so he looked for evidence. He believed that things could be determined and, follow the laws of physics. So keep that all in mind, as like I said, as you kind of get through your Freud today and at the next lecture. Well, when Freud first returned from Paris, it didn't go so well at first, just to try to do this stuff that he had learned from Charcot. In fact, what happened was he gave a lecture to the Vienna Medical Society when he got back about his study with Charcot. And he reported Charcot's theory of hysteria to this Viennese group. And he talked about it very positively. But one of his professors that he had still there at the University of Vienna, Mesmer, objected to this theory, particularly the part suggesting that men as well as women could be hysterics. So he wasn't well received because of this lecture and his beliefs about Charcot. And Freud felt from that time forward he lost favor with this Viennese medical establishment and therefore became an outsider. He soon found he could make a living by treating ordinary neurological cases because the other doctors weren't referring them to him. So even though he had by that point bolstered his reputation by writing well-received books on cerebral palsy and aphasia, his own practice wasn't going very well. So he decided that he's going to have to start adding to his income by accepting more patients with hysteria, since he was among the very few Viennese doctors at that time who had the background and willingness to take the symptoms of hysteria seriously. And so many people came to him for help. When Freud was in France, he had visited Bernheim and Nancy, and he had watched a recently hypnotized subject showing typical post-hypnotic amnesia, until Bernheim, the hypnotist there, placed a hand on his forehead and said, "Now you can remember." And when he said that, the subject immediately recalled his entire hypnotic experience in minute detail. Freud wondered, maybe that would work with his patients to help him figure out the origins of their pathogenic ideas. Now, pathogenic ideas was a fundamental aspect of his theory about hysteria, that he believed that the patient held some sort of idea in their unconscious that was actually causing them all their misery. So the pathogenic idea is this kind of core idea that they're having little conscious access to. So he wants to help them get to that. He wants them to find that pathogenic idea. So he devised a pressure technique where he would have patients lay on his couch with their eyes closed as they would be for hypnosis, but they would remain normally awake. And then he would ask them to recall their earliest experiences of their symptoms until their memories stopped just before getting to that crucial pathogenic idea. So like they can remember all these early experiences when they had these symptoms, but if you kept pushing them, they maybe would resist to tell you what the crucial pathogenic idea was, or they didn't have access to it. So at that point, Freud would simply press their foreheads with his hand and confidently assure them that their further memories would now follow. And after repeated application of this pressure, some apparently genuine pathogenic ideas would come out, followed by an emotional catharsis and symptom relief. The patient would show relief of their hysterical symptoms. Now, he did have problems figuring out whether he was on the right path to a pathogenic idea. So as this person's talking about it, he's got to decide whether or not to put more pressure at this point or another. He eventually decided that he just better go ahead and take all of the paths. That is, he thought that everything that the patients reported was potentially significant, even if it didn't seem important at first. So he pretty much just wants to listen to everything they have to say. And finally, he realizes that he doesn't even need to apply the pressure at all with his hands. All he had to do is to encourage these patients to let their thoughts run free, even if it seemed the thoughts were irrelevant or stupid or embarrassing or whatever. And this became the method of free association, which became his standard method of treatment. He believed it led reliably to pathogenic ideas. So with his colleague Breuer, Freud published a case example of this method called Anna O, which was actually a pseudonym for a woman named Bertha Pappenheim. And what they argued there was that Anna O and other hysterics have these pathogenic ideas that are causing their misery. And he said there are three things about these pathogenic ideas. First of all, they're overdetermined. And what he means by that is that the symptoms themselves have multiple causes. Like there might be multiple pathogenic ideas causing the same symptom. So for instance, if they feel some sort of numbness in their hand, it might be that there's one pathogenic idea that has related to something they did with their hand once that they are not consciously able to remember. Or it could be that there's a completely different experience, a different pathogenic idea that also causes them to feel that their hand is numb. So overdetermined meant that he often found that a lot of these symptoms they had actually had multiple pathogenic ideas underlying them. Secondly, he found that these pathogenic ideas would be repressed. So this is the whole idea that people don't want to bring the ideas to their consciousness. They want to keep them repressed and kept in the unconscious. And therefore, you have this intrapsychic conflict where basically as the therapist is working with the patient, they're trying to bring these things to the conscious, the pathogenic ideas, so they can have a catharsis and be freed of the tension that this is causing. Normally, the pathogenic idea is down there in the unconscious and it's being repressed and it's causing all sorts of conflict for the person, which then manifests itself in the neurosis or in the hysterical symptoms. And that conflict is going to be resolved if you can bring the pathogenic idea up to consciousness. Now, what's causing those pathogenic ideas? Well, Freud speculated in a theory that he published in 1896 called the seduction theory that all of these hysterics had undergone some sort of sexual mistreatment as children. So he found patient after patient, as he would explore their symptoms and try to understand their pathogenic ideas, that ultimately it would go all the way back to some event in the patient's past when they were children where they had been somehow sexually mistreated, that there had been some sort of sexual abuse. And so he speculated that what happened was, after that sexual mistreatment or that sexual abuse had happened, that the person had developed symptoms as a function of defenses against the psychologically dangerous pathogenic ideas, that they were embarrassed, they were shamed, they felt horrible about this event that happened in the past, so it had been repressed. They weren't consciously aware of it, but this repressed idea was causing them psychic conflict, which then manifests itself in these symptoms of hysteria. So it's an interesting theory that he was observing firsthand by his actual patients reporting real sexual abuse from when they were children. The interesting thing was that about a year later, he no longer subscribed to this theory. That is, he no longer thought that the theory held up to the fact that all of them had undergone sexual mistreatment. He thought that a lot of them maybe had just had fantasies about sexual mistreatment. So what he was trying to say is it doesn't matter whether the person really had sexual mistreatment or they imagined that they did. Either one of those causes a pathogenic idea that's causing them to have these defenses and causing them, therefore, to have their hysteria. So it's like he's basically saying, I don't really want to question whether or not this is actually something that this person experienced in the past. What's more important is that we bring up this fantasy or this belief or this memory that's been held and repressed as a repressed idea and bring it to the forefront. Now, interestingly, a few decades ago, this author that you see in this book here, Jeffrey Masson, published a book called The Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory. And what he argued here was that Freud actually changed his theory to be accepted by the medical establishment, that it was too upsetting, according to Masson here, to have Freud going out there and saying, you know, my patients have all been sexually abused. That would be too shocking and too unaccepting then of the Viennese society. And so because of that, he changed his theory so he'd be more accepted. That's kind of what the book argues, and he looks at this through letters and discussions that he had with his colleagues. The only real problem with this is that we already have established that Freud was already on the outside. That is, Freud was never actually accepted by the medical establishment before this even. So in some ways, he probably could speculate a theory like this and would have little ramifications because he wasn't accepted by the university community. He wasn't really accepted by the Viennese Medical Society. The only people that were really listening to him were his patients and a few other adherents to his growing ideas about psychoanalysis. So I tend to think that this book has probably got it wrong, but I just wanted to bring it up as a possible explanation for why his theory did change about a year later. Now, another important development in Freud's thinking was dream theory. And his reliance on dreams, or why he put so much stock in them, had a lot to do with that free association technique that I was talking about, where you'd have this patient lying on his back and the person's talking about different things. And one of the things that he realized is that people frequently wanted to talk about their dreams that they had had recently. And so he would explore with them their dream. He would say, tell me about your dream, as much detail as you can remember, and then used free association to help them further kind of decompose or understand their dream. And so he, from observing other people's dreams and also keeping a dream journal himself and looking at his own dreams, he started to come up with an explanation for these dreams. And he published in a book called The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. In that book, he distinguished between what we consciously experience as the content of the dream, and that he called the manifest content. So the manifest content is the story that you remember, the weird details that you can actually report to somebody else or write into your journal. That's the manifest content. The other important aspect of dreams, though, is their latent content, which are the elements that are actually inspiring the dream, like why you're having the dream. And a lot of this has to do with symbolism and meanings about things that you have in that dream that only you associate with. Or maybe culturally everybody associates that the symbol means something. But anyway, what you have to do then in order to really understand the dream is go from the manifest content to the latent content, and do that through free association. And if you have a really good analyst, like Freud considered himself to be, they'll be a good guide to help you get through and to understand what the real meaning of your dream is, what the content of that dream is. Just to give you an example, one of the dreams that he talks about in his book is his own dream of Irma's injection. Okay, so he had dreamed of a social gathering where Irma, one of his real-life patients, had fallen ill and was given an injection of the chemical propyl by one of his medical colleagues. Then Freud vividly hallucinated the letters and numbers comprising the formula for trimethylamine, yet another chemical substance. This strange manifest content made little immediate sense to Freud, for neither propyl nor trimethylamine was a real medicine, and a propyl injection would in fact have probably been dangerous. So he used free association to help him figure out several ideas that kind of would make sense, like what these things really represented. For one, Freud thought with relief that at least it was not he himself who had administered this ridiculous injection, so his colleague would have to bear the responsibility for any unfavorable outcome. Further, he remembered that in real life, Irma's nose had been operated on by his best friend, who had neglected to remove all of the surgical packing. The patient, legally under Freud's care, had nearly died. Though Freud had made excuses for his friend and had been unwilling to blame him for negligence, he now had to admit to feelings of anger and reproach. Finally, he remembered a recent conversation with this same friend about the chemistry of sex, in which the substance trimethylamine had been mentioned. This led to the thought that Irma's illness must have been sexual in nature. So this sort of fragmentary analysis illustrates how he would just take one manifest content of a dream and then spend time trying to understand its latent content. And hopefully through analysis of the latent content, you would be able to get back to the pathogenic ideas. So dreams and hysterical symptoms, he hypothesized, resulted from similar unconscious symbolic processes. So there are like multiple ways that these pathogenic ideas can manifest themselves to consciousness. You can see them in your manifest content of your dream. You might see them in hysterical symptoms. He even talked about this in terms of jokes. And so he wrote a book called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, where he talked about slips of the tongue, or what we call a Freudian slip, or jokes that when you tell the joke, you sound like you're being humorous, but maybe you really are telling the truth. So these are all ways for our unconscious symbolic processes to manifest themselves to our consciousness. The other thing that's interesting about his idea about dreams was that he believed that all dreams represented the fulfillment of wishes. And so that was an hypothesis that he worked on, and believing that basically what your dreams really represent is what you really wish was going on. That if you, once you get to the latent content will tell you what you're really striving for, what your real motivation was. So maybe, for instance, he was actually sexually attracted to Irma, and that's maybe why he was having this dream. So that's another aspect of this that he talked about in the interpretation of dreams. So I'm about to end this lecture, but I just wanted to give us a little run into this book that I'm having assigned to go along with the next week's lecture, and that's this case of Dora. Dora is a case of hysteria that he analyzes. One of the things that you'll notice right away about this book, or maybe I think you learn this pretty quickly, is this is actually an example of where he felt he had failed his patient. So he had actually not successfully treated Dora. So it's interesting because you might think that he'd only want to go ahead and highlight all of his positive cases where he was actually right. But he was really open to the idea that he should go ahead and document everything that happened from this particular case so that he could learn from it, and other people interested in psychoanalysis would also learn from it. So in a way, this is sort of a tragic story in the sense that he didn't actually help Dora, but in the end, but you can at least get an idea of how things worked in terms of Dora. Dora herself, we actually know a lot about her. Her name was actually Ida Bauer, and there she is with her brother Otto. And so there's been a lot of historical analysis about what Ida Bauer actually went through, and pretty much everything you see in this story about Dora was true. We actually know the real names of everybody that's involved in the story. Dora herself had actually gone through lots of treatment before she got to Freud. That is, that she had these hysterical symptoms that he talks about, and a lot of this had been done to her to help her relieve these symptoms. She had been taken to different health clinics, to spas, to be treated for this. And some of this was like involved in using electrical stimulation to all different parts of her body, which would have been like you would have felt a voltage going through your body at different places. And you can see here there's an electric brush and probe that would have been inserted into her throat to apply electricity directly to her larynx to help her with her problems. Another thing she would have done is gone through daily hydrotherapy, which is basically where a cold water is sprayed on the body, and she would have been standing there nude and she would have been sprayed head to toe with really cold water. So there's a lot of terrible kind of treatments that she had already gone to. And so when she got to Freud, he was sort of like the last person on the list here. Her father had heard about Freud's success with other hysterics and thought that maybe Freud could help him with his daughter. So with that background, I'll leave you to read Dora on your own, and we'll talk more about Dora outside of next week.